We begin in the Mishnah on Tzadik Zayin Amud Beis. The Mishnah here discusses, again, examples of Karbanos Pesach that were designated to be brought as a carbon, but you didn't do it right. So what happens with these Karbanos? Hamafrish nekeva lepischai. You designated a nekeva for carbon Pesach, which is not to be used for carbon Pesach. It's only a zachar that's for carbon Pesach. A zachar ben shtei shanim. Or a zachar, but in the second year. It has to be before the first year. So it wasn't able to be used b'chlal. So what do you do with it? Yireh, you have to leave it out to graze. Achi yistav until it gets a mum. V'yimacher, you sell it. And v'yiplu damav l'nedava l'shlamim. And then the money, you buy a carbon shlamim with it. Since this is a carbon Pesach that from the first moment it was never able to be used, this is not fall into the category of Moisera Pesach, of leftovers of carbon Pesach that's just brought as a shlamim. This was rejected from the first moment. It wasn't able to be used. You were makdish it, so you sort of established it to be a carbon, but then it was rejected, so therefore you have to leave it to get a mum, and then you buy with the money a carbon shlamim. Zog the Mishnah weiter, Daf Tzadik Ches, Hamafrish Pischai, a person designated as carbon Pesach umeis, and he passed away. Lo yevienu b'noi achrav l'shem Pesach, so his son should not bring it as a carbon Pesach. There's nobody that's counted on this carbon. You have to have someone that's going to be counted on it to eat it. But his father died, so no one's going to eat it as a carbon Pesach. Elo l'shem shlamim. He'll bring it as a carbon shlamim. This is the halacha of leftovers of carbon Pesach is always brought as a shlamim. So now the Gemara goes to the first part of the Mishnah, and it points out that you have over here three different novel ideas that we learn out from the first chelik of the Mishnah. I can learn from this Mishnah here, tlas, 3 points. The first point I learn is shmamino balechayim nidochim. I can see from here that even a live animal that was designated as a carbon, once it got rejected of being brought as a carbon, it's rejected forever. How do I see that from this Mishnah? Here you have a live animal, whether in a keva, whether it was in its second year, and it got rejected from being brought as a carbon Pesach. So what do I say? Because it got rejected, so therefore it can't be brought anymore. And you do not say, well, it got rejected, but let it be brought afterwards as a shlamim. No, once it got rejected, it cannot be brought anymore. You have to leave it out to get a mum. So we see that balechayim nidachen, that even while it's alive, it gets pushed off, it can't be brought again as a carbon, even if later it would become fit again. So Rashi points out that this subject is a machlokes. Rab Shimon disagrees with this. Rab Shimon says an animal, while it's alive, that got pushed off of being a carbon, if later it became fit again to be a carbon, so then you could bring it as a carbon. But our Mishnah is saying, no, once it got pushed off, it gets pushed off. Shmamino, the second thing we learn from our Mishnah, dochoy me'ikara, an animal, a carbon that was rejected from the first moment when it was designated as a carbon, have a dichui. That's considered to be that it was rejected and you can't bring it as a carbon anymore. Right, so again, Rashi says there's an argument about this. What carbon gets a status of being rejected? There's another opinion that says if it was fit to be a carbon and then it gets rejected, that's considered to be a real rejection. But if it was rejected from the first moment, that's not called rejected. And therefore, if later it becomes fit for a carbon, you could bring it as a carbon. So right here, this carbon the Mishnah is speaking about, from the first moment that you designated it, it was rejected. It was in a keva, it was in the second year, so it couldn't be brought. And what does the Mishnah say? Once it got rejected right from the beginning, it can't be brought anymore at all. Shma Mino, the third point... Right, even as a shlamim, you have to sell it, you have to allow it to get a mum, and then you could only use the money to buy a shlamim. Shmamina, the third point we see from here, yesh dichoi b'damim. This halacha of rejecting an animal, and therefore it cannot be brought as a carbon anymore, applies even in a case where the kedusha of this behemoth is only in the value, in the money of it, not in the guf of the behemoth. So as Rashi explains in our Mishnah, since you were makdish in a keva for a Pesach, the body of the animal itself never becomes a Pesach, because a nekeva cannot be a Pesach. And the same thing in the second year. It's the value of it, it's the domim of it that became a Pesach. And yet the Mishnah says that once it got rejected in that phase, in the beginning, the money of it, that was Yom Makdish, got rejected. If later it will become fit to be used as a shlamim, no, you can't use it anymore. So I see that the concept of a carbon being rejected applies even in a case where it's only the damim, the value of this animal, that has been designated as a carbon, or you will makdish it as a carbon. So those are the chedushim that we see from this Mishnah. Now we go to the next case. It said in the Mishnah, Hamafrish Pischoi v'chulu. So it said in the Mishnah that a person had a Korban Pesach and he passed away. So his son should not bring it as a Pesach, but as a Shlomim. So here the Gemara brings a Braisa that will explain that there's a distinction to be made regarding this halacha. So Tana Rabbanon, we learned in the Braisa as follows: Hamafrish es Pischoi umeis. A person designated as Korban Pesach and then passes away. So now, im benoi memune imai, if his son was also counted on this Korban Pesach along with him, so then Yiviyanu l'shum Pesach. So then the son could bring it as a Korban Pesach because he is still alive, he's still counted on it. Ein benoi memune imai. If the son is not counted on the Korban Pesach, so then now there's nobody counted on it anymore. The father died, so Yiviyanu l'shum shlomim. So then, as it said in our Mishnah, it could only be brought as a shlomim. Now, when is it brought as a shlomim? So the Braisa says l'shisha asar. It's brought on Shisha Asar, which is on Tez Zayin Nisan, on the first day of Chol HaMoed. You don't bring it on Yontif itself. So the Gemara now explains this detail of the Braisa. L'yudvav, or l'shisha asar in, you could only bring it as a shlamim on the first day of Chol HaMoed, but l'tezvav loy. You can't bring it as a shlamim on Yontif itself, on the first day. Why not? Kasavar, because the mandamar of this Braisa holds, nidarim unidavais ein kreven b'yontif. Any personal donations that you bring as a carbon to the Beis HaMikdash cannot be brought on Yontif. Those karbanos that you're obligated to bring for Yontif could be brought on Yontif. But those that you're bringing as a personal donation cannot be brought on Yontif. So this Korban Pesach that's now a shlamim, you have to wait until Chol HaMoed, the first day of Chol HaMoed, to bring it. Now the Gemara goes back to the actual halachas of the Braisa itself. So what did we say over here? If the son was counted on the carbon, so he brings it. If he was not counted on the carbon, so you can't bring it as a Pesach anymore, it's brought as a Shlomim. So the question is, what exactly is the case? And this is a question that relates to the Braisa and also in the Mishnah before. The mis ha'av emis. What happened over here? Exactly when did the father die? Is the case that the father died before Chatzais? So now, benoi memune imai. So what did it say in the Braisa? That if the son is counted together with the father on this Korban Pesach, yivienu l'shum Pesach. So it said in the Braisa that he could bring it as a Pesach. How could he? Hachala aninus ilavei meikara. But as soon as the father passed away, and the father died before Chatzais, so he becomes an Einon, right? The day of a person's father passes away, you become an Einon. That's the day that a relative, a close relative, passes away. So an Einon cannot bring a Korban Pesach. So if the father died before Chatzais, how could he bring the Korban? So just to explain a little bit better what the Gemara is saying here, Rashi, and we'll see in the continuation of the Gemara, what are the halachas of an Einon? An Einon, based on what we learned before about this, and over here in the continuation of the Gemara, an Einon is a person that cannot eat any kachim. However, that following night, he will be able to eat kachim. Only that day he can't. But at night, he could. Minat Torah. Midrabanan he can't, but Minat Torah he could eat even at night. So really, this person that's an Einon today, Minat Torah, should be able to bring his carbon, because at night, he'll be able to eat his carbon Pesach. But there's a Gzeira Midrabanan. The Gzeira Midrabanan is, because he's an Einon and he has a close relative to bury, we're afraid that he's going to become Tameh, and therefore he won't be able to eat the Korban Pesach. So therefore the Chachamim will geyser that an Einon should not be makar of a Korban Pesach but that Gzeira has limitations, and there's two limitations. One is, that's only if the Einon is alone on this Korban Pesach. If he's the only person that was designated on this Korban Pesach, with no one else with him. If there are other people with him, then or whatever, other people, so then we're not geyser that he's going to become Tameh and then there'll be nobody on the Korban Pesach. There are other people there. That's so the old problem of an Einon is if he's alone. And that's what it seems to be speaking about over here. It said Yiviyenu, it's speaking about this person, this son, alone. Okay, so the Chachamim's Gzeira applies. Now there's another limitation regarding Chachamim's Gzeira. It depends when the person became an Einon. If he became an Einon in the morning, before the time of the Korban Pesach began, so then we say he was an Einon before the time period when the obligation of the Korban begins. So if he was an Einon before, we're afraid that his mind is preoccupied with the fact that a close relative died and he might become Tameh, so we don't allow him to bring the Korban Pesach. But if he became an Einan after Chatzais, so because he had the obligation of the Korban Pesach first, and he's already preoccupied with the Korban Pesach, even though he became an Einan afterwards, the Gzeira of the Chachamim does not apply, and he's allowed to bring the Korban Pesach. So now we can understand what the Gemara's question over here is. If the father died before Chatzais, so then how could this son, which is alone on the Korban Pesach, bring it if the Gzeira of Chachamim applies, that we're concerned that because he was an Einan from before the time when the Chiyuv of Korban Pesach takes effect, so he might become Tomei. So how could he bring the Korban Pesach? So it can't be that the father died before Chatzais. Ella, rather you're going to tell me the Misacha Chatzais. What happened is the father died after Chatzais. So now if the father died after Chatzais, so then he became obligated in the Korban Pesach first, so therefore the son could bring it, and it's we're not concerned about the fact that he's an Einan. But now the problem is going to be with what the other part of the Braisa. What did it say? If the son is not counted on this Korban Pesach, so then what do? Yivienu l'shum shlamim. This Korban Pesach could now be brought as a shlamim. The question is, how could it be brought as a shlamim? Hokovate chatzais. At chatzais time, it was established to be as a Pesach, and it was rejected from being a Pesach, so it shouldn't be able to be brought as a shlamim. This is the based on what we learned before in the Gemara. Anytime you have a Korban Pesach that was there, available to be brought at the time of chatzais, when the korban could be brought, and it was rejected, it wasn't used, so then that's not called Meisera Pesach, that's a korban that was pushed off. It was rejected, and therefore you can't bring it as a shlamim. Right. So if the father died after Chatzais, at the time when the obligation of the korban takes effect, so the korban was pushed off then. The korban was available, and it ended up getting pushed off, so how could you bring it as a shlamim? So that's our question. What happened over here? When exactly did the father die? Rashi points out that the Gemara could have seemingly given a simple answer. Maybe the father died 2 or 3 days before, and therefore the son is not an Einan anymore. He buried his father a few days before, and he's not an Einan. Maybe that's the case. So Rashi says the reason the Gemara doesn't give that answer is because that's very uncommon. People were not makdish their Korban Pesach until the day of, until Erev Pesach itself. Because you're afraid that you're going to be makdish it too early, so then it might become, you might have a gnaw of it, you might use it, misuse it. They were always... the korban was on that day, right? So therefore we're speaking about on the day of Erev Pesach itself. So that's our question. When did the father die? Before Chatzais or after Chatzais? So the Gemara here is going to give no less than 5 answers to explain this Braisa. Omar Rave, so others are greatest. Omar Rabbe, La'olam the miskaidim Chatzais. Really, I'll tell you, the father died before Chatzais and therefore can be brought as a shlamim. Now, what was our question? If the father died before Chatzais, how could the son bring it if he's an Einan? The answer is, you're right, he can't. When it said in the Braisa, the son will bring it for a Pesach, l'shum Pesach Sheni. It meant to say, not for this, he's going to bring it as a Pesach Sheni, but not now, because he's an Einan. Abaye says, since we have a contradiction, we have a problem how to read the Braisa, so let's dadin katani. We read the Braisa, and the 2 cases where there is a son that counted on it, and a son that's not counted on it, so the 2 cases of the Braisa are talking about 2 different scenarios. And the shot in the Braisa is as follows. If the father dies after Chatzais, so then b'nai memuni imai, the son that's counted on this korban, yiviyanu l'shum Pesach. He could bring it as a Pesach, because before the father died, he was already counted on the korban. And it became an Einan afterwards. So then, as I explained before, that's not a problem. Meis kaidem Chatzais, in a case where the father died before Chatzais, so then ein b'nai memuna imai, if there's no son counted on the korban, yivienu l'shum shlamim. It's brought as a shlamim because if the father died before Chatzais, this is a korban that never got rejected. From the first moment, at the time when the korban Chatzais comes, it was already not roy, it was not fit for a korban Pesach. The third answer, Rav Shravya Amar, Rav Shravya says, Lo oilam demis la'acha Chatzais. The father died after Chatzais, and therefore the son could bring it as a korban because he only became an Einan after he was first already obligated in the korban Pesach. In that case, Chachamim's Gzeira doesn't apply, he brings it as a korban Pesach. But our question was, if it died after Chatzais, how could it be brought as a shlamim? It was already rejected of being a korban Pesach. The Kagain Shahaya Aviv Geisis Bachatzais. At the time of Chatzais, the father was on his deathbed, and in such a case, because by a Geisis, the reality is most people on their deathbed die, so therefore we consider this carbon from Chatzais already to be a carbon that was not fit for carbon Pesach. So therefore it was never rejected, it wasn't there available anymore, because most people that are Geisis die. So therefore it can be brought as a Shlamim. Ravashi Omar, a fourth answer, Ravashi says, La'olam demis la'acha chatzais. Like we said before, the father died after chatzais, and therefore the son could bring it as a carbon Pesach, because he was obligated in the carbon Pesach before he became an Einon. V'Rab Shimoni, and the one that this Braisa here is saying that it could still be brought as a Shlamim, although it was there at chatzais and it got rejected, so why could it be brought as a Shlamim? So this follows the opinion of Rab Shimon, the Amma Ein Balechayim Nidochin. Rab Shimon argues with the whole premise and the last two blot of Gemara that we were learning here, that if you have a carbon Pesach that was available to be brought at the time of the carbon, and it was not, so then it gets rejected, and you can't bring it as a Shlamim. Rab Shimon disagrees with that. Rab Shimon holds animals that are alive never get that status of being rejected, and therefore it could be brought as a Shlamim. Ravina Amar, the fifth and final answer is this animal was designated after Chatzais. The whole carbon only became a carbon Pesach after Chatzais. Umeisu Bailim Acha Chatzais. And the owner, the father, died also after Chatzais. So the son could bring it as a carbon Pesach. That's not an issue, because his obligation of bringing this animal as a carbon Pesach was before the father died, because already after Chatzais, the carbon was... he was makdish after Chatzais, so the chiyuv of carbon Pesach takes effect on him first. On the other hand, though, it could be brought as a shlamim as well. The kosavar chatzais kava, and this Braisa holds that we have to look at the time of chatzais. Do I have a carbon at the time of chatzais that was a Pesach and was available to be brought? So over here in this case, the carbon was only made a carbon Pesach after chatzais. So since at the time of chatzais it wasn't yet a carbon Pesach, so therefore I don't consider it to be a carbon Pesach that got rejected. So if it's not a carbon Pesach that got rejected, it could be brought as a shlamim. Okay. Right? So that's the case that this Braisa is speaking about.
But it could be that the made it a Pesach after Chatzot, and then he died after.
Yes, that's the case.
So that's the case. So then it could be a Pesach.
Well, if the father dies and there's nobody else that's counted on the carbon, no one's counted on it, so no one else could eat it. So therefore it's brought as a shlamim. Sagt the Mishnah, ha-Pesach shenis arav bizvachim, a carbon Pesach that got mixed with other karbanis. So Rashi says, for example, you have a carbon Pesach that got mixed with an oila and a shlamim. So now you don't know which animal is which. So what are you going to do? You can't bring it as a carbon. They have different halachas how to bring it as a carbon. So what do you do? So kulan yiru, all of them have to graze achi stavu until they get a mum, and then only after as a mum v'yimachru, you sell them, and what you do is you are going to transfer the kedusha of this carbon onto another animal that you're going to buy instead of them. And v'yavi now, but the problem is, let's say you have one animal that's amongst these animals, you have three over here, let's say, right? So you have one that's worth $100, a very good quality animal, then you have another two that are only worth $50. So you have three karbanis. Each, you don't know which one was the best one. So when you're going to be transferring this carbon onto another animal, you're going to have to buy three other animals that are going to be at least equivalent to the best one, because each one of these karbanis may have been the best one. You don't know which one was the best one. So therefore, when you are transferring, when you sell and you transfer the carbon onto another animal, v'yavi b'dmei yafish behen mimin zeh, b'dmei yafish behen mimin zeh, from the best, the value of the best of those animals has to be transferred for one carbon, for another carbon, for the three carbonis that you're not sure about. That value of the best has to be transferred over to another animal. Now, even though you sold these animals, you don't have three best, you only have one best. And v'yafsid ha'meisar mi beisar, you from your house, in other words, from your own pocket, you're going to have to add money in order to make up the difference to designate three new karbanis that are going to be the quality of the best one, because you don't know which one was the best. Nis'arev b'b'chayres, if you have a carbon Pesach that was mixed with the b'chayr. So now, when it's mixed with the b'chayr, so as far as the actual krava of the carbon, the shchita and the zrika of the carbon, and the bringing of the sacrificial parts in the Mizbeach, a korban Pesach and a korban B'chor are the same. We say it every morning, a B'chor, a Meiser, a Pesach. So B'chor and Meiser are the same. So as far as that, even when it gets mixed, it's not an issue. So the issue is when it comes to eating it. So Rab Shimon Oimer, so says Rab Shimon, im chaburas kayanim, if it's a group of kayanim that were counted on this korban, so when they're eating the korban, and now because it got mixed, they're not sure if they're eating a korban Pesach or if they're eating a B'chor, but if they're kayanim, it's not an issue. The B'chor is eaten by the kayanim, so yoichlu, they can eat this korban. So in such a case, it's not a problem. On this last case, we just learned here, the Gemara asks a question, but you're telling me it's not a problem? There is a distinction as far as the eating is concerned between a Pesach and the B'chor, and what is that distinction? The timing. For how long could you eat the korban? If you do it in this way, so then you're bringing kachim and you're making it puzzle before its time. Why is that? Because a korban Pesach could only be eaten that night, not the next morning. A B'chor could be eaten that night and the next morning as well. Right, for 2 days in a night. So therefore you're making the B'chor into Naisar and you're burning it before its time. So then how could you do such a thing, burning a korban Pesach that's really fit to be you're burning kachim, that is, that's really fit to be eaten. And says the Gemara, Rab Shimon is not concerned about this. Rab Shimon l'taimei, Rab Shimon follows his opinion. The Amma, he said, mevi'in kachim lebeis apsol. It's okay, you're allowed to take kachim, and when you have this kind of a suffix, and burn it even before its time, even while it's still fit to eat. The Tnan, we learned in the Mishnah, where Rab Shimon said, Asham shenis arav b'shlamim, a korban asham that was mixed with the shlamim. So what do? Rab Shimon Oimer, yishchetu b'tzafain, you shecht it on the tzafin side, so a shlamim could be shechted anywhere. A asham has to be shechted on tzafin. So because they got mixed, so you shecht it all on tzafin, and then v'yaychlu k'chaymer shebehen. And then you eat it only like the asham, which is more stringent, that could be only be eaten one day and the following night, and you don't eat it the next day. So Amrullah, the Chachamim said to Rab Shimon, if you're going to do so, it's an aim of and kachim lebeis apsol. You're not allowed to take kachim that could be eaten more time and burn it and consider it to be nice, and you're burning it before its time. So that's what the Rabbanan said. But Rab Shimon is not concerned about that. So therefore over here as well, by the Pesach and the B'chor that got mixed, he's not concerned about the fact that the B'chor is being burnt before its time. The question is, V'Rabbanan heichi avdinon. Now according to the Rabbanan, when the B'chor and the Pesach got mixed with each other, so what do you do? What do you do now in such a case? Right? So Rashi here explains, you would think simply that you do in this case the same thing that it said in the Reisha of the Mishnah. You just take both of the animals and you transfer, you sell them, and you transfer the kedusha of these animals onto other animals that you buy. So Rashi says, no, you can't do that with a B'chor. Why not? Because there's a pasuk that says, Lo yisifte. A B'chor, even after it gets a mum, you don't redeem it. You can't transfer its kedusha onto anything else. When it gets a mum, so the kain eats it with its mum. It's not brought as a korban, but the kain eats it. So you can't do what it said in the beginning of the Mishnah, when you have a mixture of korbanos, to just redeem them. So what do you do in this case? So Rav explains very simple. Amarave namtun loy, we wait achiyumamu until they get a mum, and then viyavi behemishmena, you bring one animal, one fat animal, meaning there's between the two of them, there's probably one that's a better quality. So then you're going to bring an animal that's going to be at least as good as the better quality one. And veleme, he says, kol heiche de isei le Pesach, whichever one of these two is a korban Pesach, tachol aleha, we're transferring the kedusha from it we're redeeming it and transferring the kedusha onto a new animal, onto this new fat animal that you brought over here. Tachol aleha, the high.
That's the third animal.
That is a third animal, correct? And you bring the korban, you put the kedusha of the korban Pesach on that. But now you have these two animals that have a mum in them. Now one of them is a B'chor, you don't know which one. One of them is the korban Pesach, and you transferred the kedusha onto a new korban. You redeemed it. But one of them is a B'chor and you can't redeem. So between the two of them, these are two animals that are suffix B'chor. So what do? And so these two animals, you're going to have to eat them with the halachas that applies to eating a B'chor, which is a balmum. So Rashi explains, a B'chor, even after it becomes a balmum, it can't be brought as a korban anymore. But on the other hand, it's not supposed to be treated like a regular animal that's sold in the marketplace and that's weighed regularly in a store and so on. It has to be treated with more respect as a B'chor, as Rashi explains over here. So these two animals, since you don't know which one is a B'chor, so you're going to have to treat them both with the same status as a Bechor, which is a Balmum. Sagt the Mishnah, Chabura she'ovat pischa, a group of people that lost their Korban Pesach. You could imagine then, and there's such a commotion with so many people, so this could happen. They lost the Korban Pesach. So va'amru le'echad, so the people in the group said to one of them, say, go ubakish and search for the Korban. Ushchait aleinu, and we're appointing you as our shliach that you're going to shecht for us. So what happened? V'halach, so he went umatza and he found the animal v'shachat and he shechted for them. So he's their shliach, he shechted for them. And v'heim lakchu v'shachtu, they weren't relying on him, they weren't sure if he's going to find it, so they also went and shechted their own Korban Pesach. So what happens here? Which one do they use? So im shalai nishchat rishayin, if this shliach that they sent, his Korban was shechted first, so hu eichel mishalai, he shechted his Korban Pesach, so he eats it, and but v'heim eichel imay mishalai, the entire group has to also eat with him because they appointed him as their shliach, and he shechted his first. So that was the one that becomes their Korban Pesach. Ve'em shalehen nishchat rishayin, if the one that the group took, that's the one that got shechted first, so then hein eichlen mishalahen, they will eat from theirs that was shechted first, and v'hu eichel mishalai, and he's going to eat his because he's not counted on their Korban Pesach. He went and found the original Korban Pesach, so he eats his, and they, since they shechted theirs first, so therefore they removed themselves from being counted with him, although they appointed him as a shliach, but once theirs got shechted first, so they get removed from that and they eat from theirs. Now what happens, if it's unknown which one got shechted first, you don't know where you belong. Or both of them ended up getting shechted at the exact same time. So who eichel mishalai? This one person that went out to find the Korban, he could eat from it because that's his. He already removed himself from any. He was never counted on the other Korban Pesach, that is. So he eats his. But for him, they appointed him as their shliach. So now there's a problem. They can't eat with him because possibly they shechted their Korban first and they removed themselves from his. And v'shelahen, and also their own, they can't eat their own either because possibly this person that they appointed as a shliach, possibly his Korban was shechted first and they have to eat from his. So they don't know what they should eat. So therefore they can't eat his and their own as well. Yetzel lebeis hasreife, has to go out and be burnt. But upeturim elasas Pesach Sheni, they are potter of making a Pesach Sheni because a Korban Pesach was brought for them. They can't eat it. We don't know which one it is. But as Rashi says, the Mishnah holds that the achila of the Korban is not ma'akiv. Even if you don't eat it, you don't have to bring a Pesach Sheni. Now the Mishnah says the same exact halacha, but with a reverse case. Omar lehen, one of the people of this group that lost the Korban said to the rest of the group, Im echarti, if I'm going to search for the Pesach, but if I'm going to be delayed, then tz'u v'shachtu alai, I appoint all of you to be a shliach for me, to shecht for me. So he appointed them as a shliach. They never appointed him as a shliach, actually, but he appointed them as a shliach to shecht for him. So now the same halacha will apply, but just in the reverse. Halacha matzah, he went out and he found a Korban v'shachat, and he shechted v'hein lakchu v'shachtu, and they went and got a new Korban v'shachtu, and they shechted as well. Im shalahen nishchat rishayin, if the group's Korban was shechted first, so then hein eichlim mishalahen, so they eat from that Korban that's theirs, and v'hu eichel imon, and he also eats with them. He appointed them to be his shliach, to be along with them. V'im shalai nishchat rishayin, if this individual shechted one that he found first, so then hu eichel mishalai, by shechting his first, he removed himself from theirs, so therefore he eats his first, and v'hein eichel mishalem, and they eat from theirs, so then everything's good. But v'meina yedua, if it's unknown, ezemem nishchat rishayin, which one was shechted first? Oy, sheshachtu shneim ke'echad, or it turns out that they both were shechted at the exact same time, so then hein eichel mishalahem, v'hu ein eichel imohen, so they could eat from theirs, because they know they never had an issue, they are only shaykh to their Korban that they are bringing, but v'hu, he appointed them to be his shliach, so now we don't know if he belongs to theirs or to his own. There's no which one was shechted first. So v'hu ein eichel imon, he can't eat along with them. Possibly his Korban was shechted first. V'shaloi yetzel lebeis hasreife, and his own, he also can't eat his own. Possibly theirs was shechted first. So then he has to burn his Korban. But upater malasas Pesach Sheni, he's exempt of bringing the Pesach Sheni because either way there was a Korban Pesach that was shechted for him. Another case, How about if they both appointed each other to be a shliach, whoever finds it first? Amar lehen, he told the people of the group, shecht for me, and va'amru loy, and they also appointed him and said to him that if you find your first, you should be our shliach. So they're appointing each other. So then, oichlin kulan min harishain, they all eat from the one that was brought first. V'men yudua eize mehen nishchat rishain, if it's unknown which one was brought first, so then shneien yaitzin lebeis hasreife. So then nobody can eat it from any of the karbanos because nobody knows where he belongs. You don't know, you belong to the one that was shechted first, but you don't know which one that is, so they both have to be burnt. How about in a case of lo yam alehen v'lo yamru loy? Pesach, carbon Pesach of a group gets lost. They didn't appoint each other as shluchim. One guy went out to find his carbon, and the rest brought their carbon. They didn't designate each other as shluchim at all. So then, ein achrain zel lezeh, they're not responsible for one another, and everyone does his thing, and everyone brings his carbon. There's no issues at all. You don't have to look at which one's first, which one's second. Another halacha, shtei chaburos shenis arvu peschayim. You have two groups that have their carbon Pesach, and their karbanos got mixed with one another. So now you don't know which one belongs to you. So you're mono, you're counted on one carbon, but you don't know which one it is. So what do you do? So now, as the Gemara will explain later, you would simply think, well, very simple. Before the shechita, if you don't know which one belongs to you, so let both groups of both karbanos totally remove themselves, and then redesignate themselves, appoint themselves for whichever animal they want. Can't they just redo the whole thing? So the answer is no. The Gemara says that you can't just remove an entire group from a carbon. You can remove one or two or any individuals of a carbon, but there always has to be someone left that's counted on that carbon originally. So they can't completely remove themselves. So what do? So Eilu Moishchen Lehen Echad. One group takes one animal, and the other group takes another animal. And then what we do is as follows. Echad me'elu, one person of one group, bala yetzel elu, comes to the other group. And the same thing, v'echad me'elu, one from the other group, bala yetzel elu. So one person will exchange groups. And the kachem oimrim. And then what they say is as follows. Im shalanu hua pesach hazeh. If we took the right carbon pesach, this is ours. So then yedecha meshuchais mishalcha. You should be removed of your original carbon. And then im neisal shalanu, and you join us. Vim shalcha hua pesach hazeh. If this animal that we took was really yours, so then yedeinu meshuchais mishalanu. We are removing ourselves from our original carbon pesach. V'nimninu al shalcha. And then we're going to be counted with you on this carbon Pesach. So they are essentially exchanging the groups over here, but they're doing it in a way that the entire group is not removing themselves of the carbon Pesach all at once, because that can't be done. So over here, there's always going to be someone that the carbon Pesach belongs to. The same halacha will apply if it's chamish chaburais, if it's 5 groups, shal chamisha, of 5 people, you do the same thing with all 5 groups. Or if it's shal asara, or if it's 10 people or 10 groups, moishchen lahen echad mikol chabura v'kachem oimrim, you take one person of each group, and he joins another group, and they say the same thing that we just explained before. Shnayim, what happens if you have 2 people, shenis arvu pischayim, that their karbanos Pesach got mixed? So over here the point is, before we were talking about 2 groups that their carbon Pesach got mixed with one another. But now we're just talking about 2 individuals, Reuven and Shimon. One has a carbon Pesach, the other one has a carbon Pesach. There's no one else along with them, and the karbanos Pesach got mixed with one another. So again, they can't just decide to take one animal and redesignate themselves, because you can't completely remove yourself of a carbon with no one left on the carbon and just join another carbon. Someone has to be left there. So what do? So Moishech lo yachad, each one will take one animal. One of them will just choose one animal, and the other one will choose an animal as well. But now, in order that they shouldn't completely remove themselves of the carbon without anyone left, what you do is so Reuven, for example, has to appoint another person along with him from the market, and Shimon is going to have to join another person from the market along with him. So now they're not alone anymore. Each one has 2 people on the carbon. And then we can do the same, similar to what we said before. So now the one from this animal comes to the other, and the one from this goes to the other. They exchange. And then they say as follows, and this is what they say. Im shalihu pesach zeh, if this animal that I now came to is mine, so then yadecha meshuchais mishalcha, so your hands, your designation should be removed from your original carbon, and you'll join me over here. V'nimneis al shali, and you'll join me with this one. V'im shalchau pesach zeh, if this carbon pesach over here is yours, and I'm coming to join you, so then Yadi mishuchais mishali, I'm removing myself from the carbon that I had, that I chose before, and v'nimneisi al shulcha, and I'm joining you here on this carbon. So like this, they could exchange and they could redesignate themselves on a carbon without ever anyone fully removing themselves of a carbon.